One of the most shocking moments in American history took place on the 14th of April, 1865, inside of Ford's Theatre in Washington, D.C. The 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, was approached by John Wilkes Booth and was then shot whilst he watched the play, Our American Cousin. Despite Wilkes Booth being the one who pulled the trigger, the plot to kill the president ran deeper, with a group of conspirators being part of a bigger plan to take out the remaining heads of government. These men and women were then sentenced to death and were executed on a huge gallows. But one man who was tasked with taking out William Henry Seward, the Secretary of State, was Lewis Powell. He was a man who was dangerous, but what is the story of his execution? Join us today as we look at the execution of Lewis Powell, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Lewis Powell was born in Alabama on the 22nd of April, 1844, and he was the youngest of 8 children. His father was a Baptist minister, and the family moved to Georgia as his father was appointed as a pastor of a local church. The family then had owned slaves, but they then freed them, and in his early life Lewis Powell was considered a shy but well-liked boy who had a number of hobbies. He regularly attended church, and he then became a nurse and would look after stray animals in his spare time, but the family would never know what he would later become. When he was 13, he had an accident after his jaw was broken by a mule kick, but the family were then forced to sell their farm, and they moved to a small village in Florida. But in June 1861, Powell left home and he enlisted to become part of the 1st Company of the 2nd Florida Infantry. He lied about his age, and his unit fought in the Peninsula Campaign, and Powell became a solid soldier who was shrouded with accolades and praise from his commanding officers. He was known for being a man who shot to kill, and it was said that he took with him the skull of a Union soldier who he had killed, and that he used this as an ashtray. He did return home briefly to see his family, however he then went back to the army, and he continued to fight on. He fought at the Battle of Gettysburg, and he was shot in the wrist and was captured as a prisoner of war. He was held in a camp, but then he worked as a nurse in the camp after recovering. He then had a relationship with a woman named Maggie Branson, who was also a nurse, and she then took Lewis to her mother's boarding house in Baltimore. The Branson boarding house became known as a Confederate safe house, and where Confederates would meet and where spies would gather. Powell spent some time here, and he then spent some days with Gilmore's Raiders, a group of cavalry soldiers detached from the 2nd Corps. He then joined Mosby's Rangers, a group of partisan soldiers. While serving under John S. Mosby, he became known as Louis the Terrible, as he was a dangerous and ferocious soldier, and he lived as a civilian most of the time until the time came to raid. He continued to attack with the group during a number of battles, and he captured a Union Army lieutenant in his final action, and was given the privilege of taking him to a Confederate prison. Around January 1865, Lewis Powell deserted and he left for Richmond, selling his horse, and he purchased a train ticket. He crossed Union lines, saying he was a refugee, but then he became in contact with a group of conspirators who were planning to kidnap President Abraham Lincoln and to turn him over to the Confederates. Powell met John Wilkes Booth in Baltimore, and Booth treated Powell to lunch, and he was recruited into the plot to initially kidnap Lincoln. He then became the second most important person in the plot, and Powell would then appear at Mary Surratt's boarding house in Washington, which became a site integral to the plot. The kidnap plan ultimately did not work and this failed, but then things turned up and the scheme shifted to becoming an assassination plot. But along with this, Lincoln was not the only target. Lewis Powell learned of his role in the plot, which was to assassinate William Henry Seward, the Secretary of State. On the afternoon of April the 14th, Booth found out that Lincoln would be attending a play at Ford's Theatre, and they then decided this was the time to attack, and Powell was dispatched to go and take out the Secretary of State. Powell arrived at 10:10 p.m. to Henry Seward's house, and Seward was inside and was injured after being involved in a carriage accident. He was recovering, and Powell, who was armed with a Whitney revolver, a large knife, and was dressed in dark clothing, rang the bell, and the door was opened, and Powell said he was sent to give Seward some medicine. However, Powell then pushed past, and he went to the 2nd floor bedroom. Seward's son appeared on the stairs, and Powell said he was delivering medicine, but his son refused to let him in. But then Powell managed to pull out his gun and pull the trigger with the barrel against Seward's son's head, but it then misfired. He then pulled out his knife and went through Seward's bedroom door, and he began attacking him in the throat and face. He cut through Seward's cheek and caused a lot of blood to flow, and he believed he had killed him. But then Lewis Powell was confronted and he tried to leave. He attacked another man and then threw away the knife and disappeared into the night. Powell was now on his own in Washington, which he had no clue about, and he mounted his horse and then rode north of 15th Street. He returned to the boarding house for help, and his clothes were still bloody. When he got to the doorstep, he claimed to have been a labourer, but he was then taken into custody, and a box of pistol cartridges was found on his person. He was held in prison and was then placed on trial along with the other conspirators, and Powell was not treated well in prison. He was always held in manacles, and also shackles were placed around his ankles, and he slept on a straw pallet. He had the same food served to him, and they were not allowed to wash for a number of days. He kept banging his head on the walls of his cell, and he was then forced to wear a padded hood, but this was not ideal, and when he was brought to trial, he sat alongside the other conspirators in wrist and ankle manacles. But despite pleas, the evidence against Powell was overwhelming. There were suggestions that he was insane, but he was then sentenced to death. Powell was the first to be told he was to be killed and to be executed, and then in the final moments he spent time with his pastor. Powell told this man everything, and he wept for his fate, and he also tried to get Mary Surratt, the only woman condemned, off her charge. This was not successful, and the night before his death he slept for 3 hours. A gallows had been made in the Arsenal courtyard, which was 12 feet high, and Powell then made a statement exonerating others. At 1:15 p.m. on the 7th of July 1865, the prisoners were taken through the courtyard and then up the steps of the gallows. Each of the prisoners' ankles and wrists were shackled, and around 1,000 people were there to witness the proceedings. The prisoners were led up the scaffold, and the condemned were all sat on chairs together. White cloth was used to bind their arms to their sides, and also tie their ankles and thighs. Powell's priest thanked the prison guards, and asked them to say a final prayer for him, and tears filled Lewis Powell's eyes. He said that Mrs. Surratt is innocent. She does not deserve to die with the rest of us. Following this, he was led forward, and a noose was then placed around his neck, along with a white bag. Powell said through his hood, "I thank you, goodbye." Following this, the drop was then activated, and Lewis Powell's body swung wildly, and he was then declared dead and cut down 30 minutes later. Lewis Powell was an integral part of the Lincoln conspiracy, which aimed to take out the top of the American government. He was a man tasked to assassinate, but ultimately he failed in his task, and for this he was executed on a huge gallows. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.